Hi, welcome to Assurity's Good Business Podcast. I'm Matt. In this show, we're talking to the leaders who are successfully making business better for the world, from eco-friendly changemakers to companies that give back to their people and communities in a big way. I'm excited to bring you this episode. Today's guest is arguably one of the foremost experts on the B Corporation movement and how responsible business is changing the world. Dr. Christopher Marquis is the Samuel C. Johnson Professor of Sustainable Global Enterprise at Cornell University, and the author of a book titled Better Business: How the B Corp Movement is Remaking Capitalism, which came out in September of 2020. Chris worked and taught at Harvard Business School for 10 years, where he developed an award-winning course on social entrepreneurship, and over the last decade, he's studied how the B Corporation movement has evolved and spread across the world. I was lucky enough to get Chris on the show to talk about his work and research, and what we can learn from the B Corp movement. If you want to learn about how B Corps work and what the movement is about, I'd recommend listening to episode 2 of our podcast with Becca Quirk. Let's start from the beginning. Chris found his way to the B Corp movement and this area of study in an unexpected place, the classroom where he was teaching.
I've always had an interest in businesses doing good, sort of, socially responsible businesses, environmentally responsible businesses. And I was teaching on that for a long time, but it was mainly things like large companies' CSR programs. And one day in class, a student said to me, what about companies that have social missions embedded? And actually the whole purpose of the company is actually helping with some social issue or social problem or environmental issue. And that really sort of turned me on to this idea that actually businesses at their core could be doing good. And through a number of years then teaching, broadly speaking, still on CSR, students through their student projects, through bringing up B Corps and the idea of B Corps, really got me on the path of studying these businesses that really are focused on good.
From there, Chris went on to study the B movement as a whole, as well as digging into the specifics of certain large B Corps, building up the expertise that's led him to this point and watching the movement grow worldwide.
Well, first of all, I did sort of my first foray into studying social businesses. I actually did a case study on B Lab to really understand, the system, both, sort of the B impact assessment. What was very new then was actually benefit corporation law. Actually, soon before I published the case study, the first benefit corporation law was passed in Maryland and then Vermont. And also the work that B Lab has been doing with investors around sort of tools to sort of monitor and track the social impact of investments. And so I think a set of cases I've done have been on B Lab, actually. So in 2010, that first one was published. Also in 2015, I published an update of that. And then that actually sort of naturally flowed into the book that I published in 2020. On the actual B Corporation side and sort of social business side, there's been a lot. I guess some of the key ones I think that I've done that are very important is large companies. So I looked at how Danone North America, this is a $6 billion company, largest B Corp in the world, largest benefit corp in the world, how it actually transitioned into a B Corp, the challenges with doing an assessment when the company has 5 or 6 legal subsidiaries. So I think how large companies are able to take this on is definitely an area of interest and focus of mine through my writing. I also did recently a Stanford Social Innovation Review article on this. A second area that I think is really interesting and important is non-US companies. When I first got started studying B Lab and B corporations, it was an entirely US focused movement, and how it has spread over the past, I guess, maybe 7-8 years, first to Latin America, then to Europe and the UK, and now everywhere. I mean, Africa, China. I did actually a formal whole case study on the first B Corp in China, sort of the challenges from translating the BIA to things like ideas of what living wages are, or certification of LEED buildings don't exist really. So the challenge of taking the B Corp assessment internationally has been a second area that I've looked at in depth.
I was able to read Chris's book before the interview, To get you up to speed, here's the premise in his own words.
The core argument of the book is that, capitalism, particularly as it's practiced in the U.S., but also more broadly around the world, and particularly for larger companies, is fundamentally broken. J. Cohn Gilbert, who's one of the founders of B Lab, frequently refers to it as like a system flaw. And what it is that we've developed a system of shareholder primacy. People think this is natural, that sort of the shareholders, the owners of companies should actually come first. This is actually a historical aberration, started about 50 years ago by Milton Friedman with an influential essay in the New York Times Magazine, where he argued, I think the title of the piece was, the corporate social responsibility of companies is to make profit. And that really, as long as companies were focused on profit, everything would work out. And that actually really created a lot of serious problems. So one, you mentioned this idea of externalities in your question. So the idea of, when a company is contemplating, installing a new factory, the idea of like who pays for the pollution that comes from that, the health consequences that for the local communities, global warming that affects all of us, really don't get factored into the cost. Whereas when companies are so focused on shareholders and quarterly earnings, things like that, get sort of pushed to the side. So the idea that companies should actually be caring for their stakeholders and actually prioritizing stakeholders other than shareholders has really caught on in the past number of years. Many influential large investors, corporate groups like the Business Roundtable. It's this group of 200 largest company CEOs in the United States. They came out with a statement in late 2019 saying that the purpose of a company is not to just primarily meet shareholder needs, which is which actually their statement of purpose of the company was before, but to meet stakeholder needs, they said. So things like employees, communities, the environment. And this is what I mean by sort of interdependent, is that companies, recognize and take responsibility for their stakeholders.
Out of all the things that Chris has seen while studying social business, one of the most surprising features of these organizations is their resilience. Something that's been highlighted even more in the pandemic that we're experiencing as this episode was recorded.
Before Cornell, I taught for 10 years at Harvard Business School, and I taught there through the 2008 financial crisis. And I just actually started my class on social responsibility and social innovation in, I think, 2007. And, many of my colleagues said, oh, it's too bad you spent all that time starting that class because, now with the financial crisis, no one's going to be interested. Companies aren't going to care about this. And actually, I found the opposite. And I think similar to how some companies have stepped up in the pandemic, that actually when there is a widespread, social, economic, health, public health crisis like the pandemic, leading companies see that as a time that they can actually, live their values and actually, and show to their employees and stakeholders what it actually means to be a stakeholder-driven company. So I do think there is, early on a lot more skepticism. I think people have started to come around, and I think, investors, lawmakers are really starting to take interest.
Another theme that's found throughout Chris's book, and one he just touched on, is the remarkable success that B Corps have seen in the legal and investment spheres, areas that were, for a long time, seen as uphill battles for the movement. I asked him about some of the investor and legal victories that he's seen as he watched the movement evolve.
Yeah, I think a couple of things. I mean, I think that the investor thing is really important to emphasize because this is really a new phenomenon. I'm thinking back to the early times when I taught the B Lab case study to my students. 2010, 11, 12. The idea that investors would be enthusiastically embracing social mission, social impact companies, would be sort of laughed at. I mean, it was okay and would work well for companies like Patagonia, that's owned by like 4 people in the same family, so they can do whatever they want, Or, sometimes when companies are like that, like Ben and Jerry's, they end up selling out to, a company like Unilever, which, Unilever is doing a great job with Ben and Jerry's now, but initially there were some issues. Uh, so yeah, so I think that there was always very early an idea that these companies were really limited because they were limited in the investors that they could get. And just this summer, there's been so many things that have happened that show that sort of assumption that people have had for a very long time is wrong. So, three companies in the past number of months have gone public: B corporations and B corporations benefit corporations. These would be Lemonade Online Insurer, Vital Harvest, which is a sort of pasture-raised egg and dairy company, and then also App Harvest, which does indoor farming at massive scale, has Martha Stewart on the board. And I think that's really showing, okay, here the public markets are actually really enthusiastic about companies with social mission. And this has been, when I first started out studying this, there was this group of impact investors, people that were thought of as sort of a little bit, a little crazy. They would actually, sort of care about companies' social mission as well as financial mission, and always again the thinking that it was a very limited pool. But the companies that I mentioned just went public. I mean, these companies now, B Corps, all the leading venture capital companies, from Kleiner Perkins to Andreessen Horowitz to Google Ventures, Goldman Sachs Ventures, all are investing in B Corps because they see that actually companies that are managed for the long term actually are really good investments. And just also this summer, another few sort of major events that have happened are companies taking votes. These are companies that are already public, and they want to transition to stakeholder governance. So changing their underlying articles of incorporation, sort of the legal foundation and charter of the company, to say we're not shareholder primacy focused. We are in business to deliver value to all of our stakeholders. And so, Danone did this, a French company, and also Amalgamated Bank, a bank here in New York City where I live. But I think what is actually even more revolutionary, and this actually just came out yesterday, a company named Viva Systems. The SEC approved their proxy statement, and on January 14th, they're going to be taking a vote of their shareholders to transition from a regular C Corp into a public benefit corporation. And this will be, Danone and Amalgamated Bank, they took votes to change their underlying articles of incorporation, but it was not to become a public benefit corporation. But this will be the first time in history that a company has through shareholder vote changed into a public benefit corporation. I think is actually revolutionary in that, this is the uptake by investors. I think just shows that this is a movement that is really very scalable right now.
What's remarkable looking at every part of the movement, from the concept itself to some of the creative legal and investment strategies that businesses have employed, is its ingenuity.
Yeah, I think this is something that is not super recognized in the public, but I think I'm actually thinking about doing a book on this, actually, about how B Corps and social businesses, in general, are some of the most innovative and creative companies in the world. And the reason being is that, you have these, multiple objectives that they're trying to achieve, both sort of financial and social objectives. And so, for a long time, businesses did business. Social objectives were focused on by NGOs or government. So the bringing together of this sort of business and society, it's not natural. And so it really takes a lot of, sort of creativity and thought for how to actually go about doing it. So, one example that I frequently give is open hiring innovations that were created by Greyston Bakery. So, the founder of Greyston Bakery, he really wanted to create an inclusive and fair workforce. So, he had this idea, well, let's just hire people that show up. It's sort of this like you show up, you put your name on your list. There's not all this background checks, which screen out a lot of people very unfairly because of maybe having gone to prison or other things that don't really affect the way they can work, but actually leads to some negative bias against them. To people are biased, as is well known, for sort of race and other characteristics. So this idea of open hiring, where there's not actually this intensive screening process, it sounds counterintuitive, but it actually has worked really, really well and created a much more sort of fair, open, and productive workforce. I think there's been a lot of innovation also around environmental products. So I think about companies like Preserve, which the founder Eric Hudson, he really wanted to take recycled plastic and turn it into actually really useful products, and initially did razors and toothbrushes, now does a whole bunch of things. But actually, it's interesting, we all recycle a lot, I'm sure probably all your listeners are recycling like crazy. I know I do it. But actually the extent to which the plastic actually gets turned in, actually recycled and then actually turned into products is surprisingly low. And so Eric, it was even worse in the 1990s when Eric started his business, but he's gone and continue to push the envelope. Now they have products, I think it's called Poppy, like Preserve Ocean Plastic Initiative, where they specifically focus on plastics that are in the ocean or about to sort of get swept into the ocean. We have this huge Pacific plastic patch, and then taking those plastics specifically and turning it into useful products. So I think the idea that, okay, let's solve this social problem through this unique business arrangement, is not how things have worked in the past. And so there's a tremendous amount of creativity and innovation that actually occurs through these entrepreneurs.
Another area where B corporations have found creative solutions to legal and institutional issues is by adapting their very frameworks to better solve problems. For instance, there's been a rise in groups opting to become B corporations instead of nonprofit 501c3s. While this isn't the solution in every case, Chris has watched this approach gain success in certain situations.
There are problems in the world that are, can't be solved by some sort of business model. And there obviously is always going to be need for NGOs and the government. But there are certain problems that actually perhaps some commercial engine behind it makes a lot more sense. So, one of the companies that B Corps that I talked to is actually Cornell grad. So I want to give a plug for Cornell. Founded at a company called Practice Makes Perfect, and they provide sort of learning solutions for schools. And they realized that actually they were spending so much money, like raising funds, that actually they weren't spending enough time sort of focusing on developing curriculum. And they realized, well, actually this is actually products that we could sell, and then we could grow our business, scale it to more schools, and not have to worry about spending all of our time on fundraising, which we would have to do as an NGO. So that's sort of an example of where I think, thinking about, the problem or the social issue that an entrepreneur wants to address, and what is the best model to actually get that done in a sustainable and long-term and scalable way. And sometimes, it might be through policy in the government. Sometimes it might be through NGO and raising funds and giving them away in some ways, or creating services that can't be paid for by a commercial arrangement. Sometimes it's actually creating a business around it. And so I think that this has been a huge change in the last 20 years, where entrepreneurs, they're able to sort of identify their problem and then have a range of different potential solutions to address it.
And it isn't just local. As we've mentioned before, the B movement is growing globally. In many cases, it's growing faster around the world than it is here in the United States. This is something that Chris has seen firsthand.
It's really amazing to me, sort of having watched this movement grow, how it's just taken off in so many areas of the world. So I'm someone who, I've spent a lot of time in Asia. I've spent a lot of time in Europe, and there is a resistance generally to American products and American things. America is very popular. We have great cultural products, and but there is it's in some cases a resistance. But it's really surprised me how this has really been taken on by entrepreneurs. I mean, they see this as a model that is tremendously useful that can then, actually help their own sort of business infrastructure. So one of the things more recently on the global side that has really impressed me is how in Europe and Latin America, large companies have taken to the B Corp movement like they have not in the US. So for instance, B Lab recently introduced a program called B Movement Builders, which I sort of think about it as sort of a slower on ramp to becoming a B Corp. If you think about the complexity challenge of going through the B impact assessment, I mean it's super rigorous as it should be, but it also it's very daunting for many organizations. And you think about if you end up having a company that has scores of legal subsidiaries in 20, 30 more countries. I mean, it actually becomes virtually, it's mind-boggling or virtually possible. Like, where do I start? So this actually provides sort of a pathway for companies to, start with subsidiaries or part of their business using the BIA, and then progressively over time increase the scope of that. It also actually, at least initially, it has a cohort feature to it. So, in this initial launch, there's 6 companies that have signed up. So Danone, which we've talked a little bit about already, while the North American subsidiary and about 25 other Danone subsidiaries are already B Corps. The global organization, which is a $30 billion company, has committed to becoming a B Corp by 2025. Natura, which is a South American in Brazil natural cosmetics company, owns the Body Shop, and Avon is part of this as well. And then 4 other companies, 2 in Europe and 2 other ones in Brazil. And, I think it's really exciting that actually, we have these 6 companies, but it's a shame that actually there's no US companies. And I think maybe it might point to actually that, you think about as the B Corp movement scales over the next 10 to 15 years, as these large companies come on, it does seem that, some of the center of weight of the movement is going to be shifting to, Europe or Latin America. I think part of it is that, those 2 places have a much more sort of longer term, sort of regenerative capitalism idea. And, business is much more involved in social, social policy. The government and business work together in a much more close way. So some of them are family-owned businesses as well, which actually also have a longer-term orientation. So I think that this, B Corp movement internationally, is only going to continue scaling. And actually, given the interest of large companies in the B Corp movement in Europe and Latin America, it makes me think that, the next phase is going to be more focused outside the US than inside of it.
Of course, it isn't all roses in the B Corp movement. There are still challenges that the movement and that individual businesses face every day. I asked Chris what he thought the biggest challenges were.
I think the biggest thing is consumer awareness and support. I think it's one of these things that I'm optimistic about it, but for a long time, no one knew what a B Corp was. There were pockets of people that did. Like when I go into my classes, one of the first things I ask during one of the classes before we talk about B Corps is, who's heard of B Corps? And over half the students raise their hands, and probably the people that we hang out with because we talk about it, know what B Corps are. But I think that when I was doing the research for the book, this was what a lot of people brought up as something that was getting a little frustrating. Some of them expressed that, they felt like they were investing. These are companies. These companies were investing in the movement and the brand, and they felt that, they wanted actually the brand to mean something more to consumers, both for their own companies, but then also there is all this data and surveys you see where individuals are really they want to actually buy from good companies, but it's hard to identify what those good companies are. So also, having this logo that identifies this is a company that has been certified for its environmental, social impact is useful for the world. And so it's hard to get traction, I think, on this because it's a complex thing. It's not like, organic or fair trade where it's very specific to like a product or some sort of offering. So it's about the entire company and the company's wide-ranging set of objectives. So I think it's a little more complex for people to sort of wrap their heads around, but it has been increasing, and I think that also with large companies like Danone and others, starting to put the logo on all their products, this also will increase consumer awareness. So I see that, the consumer awareness piece is the biggest hurdle in some way, or the biggest challenge. And like I said, I'm optimistic about it because so many really innovative B Corps are also working on it.
And as far as getting the word out, it's happening, but it's gradual. Here's the advice Chris had for how to spread the news.
I mean, I think that doing these things like you guys are doing. I mean, you have this podcast. I think having events. That one of the things that really impressed me is a lot of times there would be events like various entrepreneurship fairs or other things when school is starting off, and many B Corps would actually in those localities, university localities, actually go and have something on B Corps, and that's an example. I think that all B Corps should be putting the B Corp logo on their products. This is something that has changed over time. A lot of companies early on were not putting the logo on their products, and some of the early adopters like Patagonia and Ben & Jerry, I think it took a while, but more recently they've been doing that. So I think that just trying to promote the movement through through sort of creative and smart ways, like I mentioned, different sort of college fairs or having a podcast or is one way, but then also just putting the logo on packaging is another way.
Well, we'll keep doing what we can to publicize the B movement. And you can help too by sharing this podcast, telling your friends, or keeping an eye out for the B Corp logo on products you buy. At the end of our episodes, we like to thank our guests by making a $100 donation to the charitable organization of their choice. Here's what Chris picked.
There's a charity that my family's been involved with for a long time. It's called the Latin American Children's Fund. And it's a 100% volunteer run charity. So all the money actually goes to, it's a variety of, kids-oriented things mostly in El Salvador and I think Guatemala as well. So I think that's the one that I'll choose because I know the money will go to a good place.
You can learn more about the Latin American Children's Fund at their website, lacfund.wordpress.com. We'd like to thank Chris for coming on the show once again and sharing some of his vast knowledge. There's a lot more where that came from, so if you're interested in Chris's work, you can visit him at his website, chrismarquis.com. That's Chris, MARQUIS.com. Or you can buy his book online or at your local bookstore. The title again is Better Business: How the B Corp Movement is Remaking Capitalism. And if you're interested in the B Corp movement at all, I can't recommend it enough. Thanks for listening to Assurity's Good Business podcast. Assurity's Good Business is a production of Assurity Life Insurance Company of Lincoln, Nebraska. If you have any questions or comments, or if you want to submit an episode topic or guest for us to interview, you can visit us online at www.assurity.com/goodbusiness, or send us a note at goodbusiness@assurity.com. And if you like what you hear, subscribe and listen to the rest of our episodes wherever you get your podcasts. Join us again next time for more stories about how businesses are changing the world. After all, it's good business. Assurity is a marketing name for the mutual holding company Assurity Group Incorporated and its subsidiaries. Those subsidiaries include but are not limited to Assurity Life Insurance Company and Assurity Life Insurance Company of New York.